so much, first of all, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be in North Carolina. This is the first time I've been in North Carolina, in fact, since I was here to do research for my book, with these hints. Actually, the book is almost doesn't really exist in hardcover in too many places anymore. But the paperback edition has just come out and is available, so it's cheaper now. In any case, I was last here when I was doing research specifically on something that touches, that's linked very much to Latino students, Latino concerns, and the Latino Awareness Month. Which is to say, when I was here in '93 doing some research for this book that became largely part of one chapter, which is called When Main Street Looks Like Little Mexico. And that's actually a quote from somebody, and it talks specifically about the way in which Latinos entered into the small towns in North Carolina, particularly focused on eastern North Carolina, quite close to here. And many of the first Latinos who arrived were farm workers who then settled in the communities and later went on to take other kinds of jobs. I draw your attention to that not so much because that's what I'm going to talk about today. In fact, it isn't. But because I think that, because it's an interesting chapter in the book that for two reasons. One, it relates to this Awareness Month. And two, because actually a lot has happened since '93. In fact, you're probably quite used to seeing Latinos around in this area now. But that's a very new phenomenon. It's a fascinating, interesting phenomenon that has a great deal to do with farm work and the role that farm work has in a larger society, a larger economy. However, because I'm talking here at the law school, and because actually most of my academic work is very much about law, and I used to teach a program, and I now teach at the University of Michigan. I teach law students there and LLMs when they take my classes. And I largely teach, my classes are very open, disciplinary classes about international human rights for the most part, but to some degree about general questions about what law means and how law functions. And so because I'm here, I thought I would make my talk a little bit more academic, and it'll be about farm workers, but it'll also be about some key questions that should be of interest, or at least are related to the kinds of things you're studying. So, and I wrote it up, although I probably will play off of what I wrote and not follow it exactly. But the law makes us feel ashamed, the meaning of law and the failure of farm labor policy. Regulation has meaning. One of the most interesting questions in legal studies, an issue that is not always considered in its full significance, involves the meaning of law. This is especially true for those laws that are not generally understood to be particularly philosophical, such as health and safety regulations. Central to any inquiry into the meaning of regulation is a consideration of the relationship between the particular code, the law itself, and its usefulness, function, and significance within society. Generally, policy-oriented analysis of regulatory law involves critical look at the success or failure of the regulation's application by state agents and agencies. However, understanding the relationship between law and its application actually rests upon a series of presuppositions about the meaning of law, an array of foundational assumptions that structure our understanding of what, in the end, law actually is. In order to help explore this question, it is useful to consider the interpretive tension between what I'm going to call for this talk formal and informal understandings of social order. To illustrate this argument and to explore its larger implications, I will consider the current Department of Labor regulations regarding the legal transportation of migrant farm workers. Within the complex array of different laws designed to produce and enable social order in the United States, this particular code is obviously of relatively minor significance, and in fact, probably almost no one in this room even knew that such a law existed. However, the questions that arise from reflecting upon the structural failures of this regulation, and I will show you that it's failed almost completely, have profound significance for conceptualizing the meaning of law, while also representing an issue that is quite literally a question of life and death for the men and women who harvest the fresh fruits and vegetables that we eat each and every day. What is the point of focusing on the meaning of law, especially as regards a case of state regulation? What, if anything, does a regulatory law actually mean? After all, regulations are generally understood to be fundamentally operational mechanisms, texts that provide the terms and conditions for how something should be done, in what way the state can intervene to ensure that these acts are done as they're supposed to be through inspections and audits and other mechanisms, and guidelines for punishing those who have failed to abide by the law, such as fines and other punitive measures. With this in mind, most policy analyses regarding regulation focus on the success or failure of a particular regulation as revealed in one of two key elements, to kind of oversimplify the case. One would be the regulation's actual code, the degree to which the code clearly states the particular issue that's being dealt with, and whether or not it can be clearly followed by all of the parties interested. And the second is the issue of application. To what degree does the actual enforcement of a particular code function as it's supposed to, and what are the obstacles towards its proper functioning? So if you have a good code, that's the first step. But if you have bad application of a good code, that also won't necessarily produce the policy that you're seeking. Yet coherent regulatory codes enforced by relatively functional state agencies do not necessarily produce desired results, even where their application is both rational and professional, or let's say reasonably rational and reasonably professional. One reason for the failure of such regulation involves an inability to adequately conceptualize the tension between formal and informal understandings of social order. To make sense of this tension, it's necessary to consider regulation as meaning, as a mode of rendering the world sensible, and a way in which state power operates towards a particular vision of social order. Regulation in this sense represents a mechanism of structuring behavior that is often in direct conflict with other modes of making meaning and influencing actions. This line of questioning requires a continual reflection on one of the most basic questions of jurisprudence, that is, what is law? A special class of workers, the historical context of farm labor regulation. I encourage anyone who's really interested in legal issues and policy to spend some time, a half an hour one day, perusing, learning something about the history of farm labor regulation, because it's really fascinating. And in the conclusion of the book, I sort of describe the condition of farm workers as a sort of alternate labor history for our country. And I say this because, in a sense, farm workers were specifically excluded from virtually all of the protective labor legislation that was passed during the New Deal era that produced what we think of as sort of the basic conditions of an employer-employee relationship: minimum wage, child labor provisions, Social Security, unemployment insurance, the National Labor Relations Act. And farm workers weren't covered by this kind of regulation until generally sometime in the 60s and 70s. And there still remain a number of very key exclusions. For example, farm workers, for no particularly clear rational reason, I would argue, are excluded from overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And there's special elements of the Fair Labor Standards Act that allow children as young as 12 to labor in the fields, despite the fact that farm work is ranked as the second most dangerous profession in the country. So you see within the actual operation of law a history of exclusion, fairly radical exclusion. I mean, exclusion from minimum wage for 30 years, for example. A continuing series of fairly significant exclusions, for example, exclusion from the National Labor Relations Act, et cetera. And then a series of federal laws that were enacted in the 70s, beginning with the Farm Labor Contract Registration Act, and then which then was superseded by the Agricultural Worker Protection Act. You don't need to know all those names, but basically special new labor laws that only apply to farm laborers as a means of trying to redress these very bad conditions that existed partly because of a long history of exclusions. So you have a series of special protective regulations that were passed that only apply to farm workers. So you often hear growers say, we're the most regulated industry. That may be debatable, but certainly there are special regulations that apply to the employer-employee relationship for farm workers that are particular and actually haven't really done the things that I suppose we had hoped they would do, which is to say haven't improved markedly the condition of farm workers. Farm workers are our nation's poorest and most marginalized class of laborers. It's also interesting to look at the condition of farm workers. I would argue that anyone interested in sort of big policy questions, especially as regards labor, or as regards the power of legislation to transform a particular social world, a particular labor world, farm workers, would learn a lot by just looking at farm laborers, whether or not they're particularly interested in farm work per se, or agriculture, or any of these issues. Because farm workers are really quite a striking group because the conditions are so bad, and because they're the sorts of people in our society that ought to have a better deal. It's almost impossible to argue against that. And the reason is because they provide very important labor that's necessary. We couldn't have pizza, for example, to the degree it has fresh fruits and vegetables. We couldn't have pizza here without the labor of these people who hand harvest all of the fruits and vegetables we eat. And the book actually begins. It's called With These Hands, and fortunately the publisher chose a good image. But it's called With These Hands because the opening image is this idea that there's a direct, visceral, intimate relationship that all of us have to farm laborers. And that I try to sort of draw out by looking at this image of when you go to a grocery store and you're walking down the aisle and there's like this big, huge thing of apples and a huge thing of cantaloupes and a big thing of tomatoes, whatever. You reach out your hand and you try to decide if that's the tomato you're going to buy or that orange or that head of lettuce. That you're mirroring the actions of farm workers in that you pick out that tomato. And actually the last hand, quite probably, to touch that tomato was probably the hand of a farm worker. So there's this kind of intimate, direct relationship. And what's so fascinating is that few Americans know much about the conditions of farm workers. And they really are quite shocking. For example, the median income of farm workers currently is $7,500 a year, which is not a lot, as you know. 2/3 of migrant families and 70% of migrant children live in poverty, regardless of their exceptional poverty for working people. We're not talking about a group of people who are not laboring for a living. We're talking about a group of people who are actually brought together only by the fact that they do a particular kind of labor. So despite the fact that they're extremely poor, fewer than 17% of farm workers use any needs-based assistance. And those are largely farm worker families, actually. Farm workers' life expectancies are lower than that of most Americans. Infant mortality rate of farm worker children is double the national average. 50% of migrant children are behind national scholastic averages as early as first grade, and the majority never graduate high school. 40% of migrant children work in the fields, despite the fact, as I mentioned, that farm labor is the second most dangerous job in the country. Now, I just lay out those statistics because it's relatively undeniable, no matter where you stand on farm worker politics or policy, that the conditions are just pretty bad. They're bad in complicated ways, which we can talk about during the question-answer period. I mean, the reasons for farm worker poverty are not that simple. It's not simply that they're not paid enough, at least in a simple sense, in that it's not only that the hourly wage is so low. It isn't necessarily lower than the minimum wage on average, and it's not lower than what people earn working in a 7-Eleven or doing a lot of jobs. But it is annually lower for reasons we can discuss. If there were very few farm workers or farm labor was relatively inconsequential element of of the American economy, these figures might be easy to ignore. If there were really not a lot of farm workers, it wouldn't be perhaps such a big deal that their conditions are so bad. Or if their component of the economy was relatively, was some sort of small element that really had little to do with the larger system that we're a part of. But in fact, that isn't true. There's roughly 1.8 million seasonal farm workers in the country. So a lot of people. And they play a central role in a multi-billion-dollar industry that you should know, living in North Carolina, is the major producer of income in many regions of the country, which is, of course, quite important politically in that there's lots of representatives who come from regions that are majority agricultural. And overall in the United States, it's one of our most competitive industries internationally, which is striking because you would think it would be precisely the kind of industry that the U.S. would not be competitive in, since it requires a lot of hand labor. Wherever there's high taxes and high regulation, you'd think it would be non-competitive internationally. But in fact, it's so competitive that we export ever larger amounts in value and in quantity of fresh fruits and vegetables throughout the world, including fairly incredible things. Like, there's some pictures in the book of people harvesting lettuce. And the lettuce that I happened to be taking the pictures of were harvested and boxed in the field, which is not uncommon. And then they were iced immediately, taken to a processing plant, iced, and put on in refrigerated containers and shipped from California to Japan, which is sort of extraordinary. I mean, to even think that could be the case, that it could be cheaper overall to get lettuce from across the Pacific than somewhere else, just as an example. In any case, so the point is that this is really a serious profession, and this is a serious component of a very big and powerful element of the economy. So it's worth paying attention to. So what is wrong with our country's farm labor regulations such that laws designed to improve the conditions of migrant farm workers and their families have so consistently failed and failed for so long? Farm workers have been and remain legally defined as a special class of laborers, as I mentioned, and that special class is worth paying attention to. When I mentioned, like in the conclusion where I talk about it being an alternate history of labor relations, one can sort of imagine what would it be like for other workers if there had never been a minimum wage for them, or if there had never been Social Security for them. When I used to do farm worker advocacy work, and we're talking 8 years ago, we would often find old farm workers, typically African-American farm workers, who, when you went to Social Security to get their lifetime earnings, and we're talking people in their 60s and 70s, nothing would show up, and they worked their whole lives. Or I remember one particular case where the only thing that showed up was the time that this man was in the service. So he had 4 years of paid-in money to Social Security, and here was this older guy who'd worked all his life in a very productive element of the economy, and yet he had no Social Security. For 2 reasons. One, because in the early part of his working career, there was no Social Security protection for farm workers. And the later part, all the crew leaders he worked for just stole the Social Security deductions, which remains quite common, especially common now because such a high percentage, roughly 50% of farm workers are now undocumented. So it's extremely common for crew leaders to deduct the Social Security and pocket it, which is a good little bonus. So let me jump ahead. Farm worker transportation. Everywhere there is order, even among the lawless. Farm workers are generally quite poor. They often don't own their own vehicles. Similarly, farm labor requires a high degree of mobility, involving long trips that must be covered by our nation's 900,000 migrant workers. And the near constant travel from one work site to another for workers laboring within a particular area. As you can imagine, farm labor it's not like going to a factory. You go from field to field. And there's a constant amount of transportation. Traditionally, farm labor contractors, and the contractors, just to be very brief about this, there's sort of 3 key players in the farm labor system. There's the growers, people who own farms and operate farms. The farm workers, the people who labor in the fields, typically doing hand labor. The majority is harvest work, although there's some other pre-harvest and post-harvest work. And then there's these contractors, who are the middlemen between the growers and the workers. And it's a very important component of the farm labor system, which we can, again, talk about when we get into questions. In any case, contractors typically provide workers to growers in a way that's quite efficient in the sense that a grower can call up a single person, a single contractor, and say, I need 100 workers, I need 150 workers from this time to this time, and the workers will get there. Traditionally, farm labor contractors or growers transported workers to and from the fields, and at times from their homes to fields located hundreds or even thousands of miles away. For years, old school buses filled with workers were a common sight in many rural areas, with some identifying the contractor by name. If you were from a rural area, you might have seen them. Federal legislation, and there's various different kinds of state legislation, so we won't really talk about that because it gets a little more confusing, requires contractors to register to transport workers, utilize inspected and approved vehicles, and like other commercial transport services, to provide reasonable liability coverage. In addition, drivers must be licensed and approved to transport farm workers. For years, contractors both abided by the law and broke the law, but they continued to transport workers in a fairly significant manner up until the 1990s. Now, there are very few contractors and even fewer growers who transport workers, formally and legally, which is to say, take responsibility for the transportation of the workers. The central reason for this is that current federal regulations require minimum liability coverage of $100,000 per seat for farm labor transportation. This is quite costly, particularly with an industry characterized by informality and a general avoidance of the law's requirements. That is, it's not an amount that is particularly high for commercial transport in general. It's just imposed on a social world and on a system that isn't used to those kind of costs and has other mechanisms of defraying those costs while continuing to bring farm workers to the fields. Currently, over 90% of federally registered contractors do not have authorization to transport farm workers. Now, they are transporting farm workers. Or rather, someone is transporting the farm workers that they employ. In California and Arizona combined, 2 very important agricultural states, there are less than 200 contractors with the legal authorization to transport workers, which is a fairly incredible statistic when you think that in those two states alone, there's something like 500,000 workers who need transportation. Or let's say half of them need transportation, 250,000. So how do these laborers get to the fields? And the answer is actually quite simple. It's through an underground, unregulated system of transportation that has evolved through the 90s. Small, unlicensed operators who are known as raiteros, which is a Spanglish. Like you give somebody a ride, and the people who do that are raiteros. Raiteros are generally farm workers who have saved enough money to buy a car or a van, pickup truck. They're unable to afford the required insurance typically. Few of the vehicles could pass the mandatory safety inspections. And in some cases, in fact, people aren't even licensed to drive. While contractors and growers are well aware of the raitero system, and if they say that they aren't, I would just, 1, not believe them, but 2, ask the question, how reasonable is that really? That you would have no idea and no concern with how people get to work. They generally claim that how workers get to and from the fields is really their business and that it exists beyond their control and supervision. And in fact, there's a good excuse for this. It's called carpooling. People say they're carpooling when they're stopped by inspectors. And even if the nature of the transportation situation looks like something that could be cited and can be cited, it still doesn't affect the contractors or the growers, who can avoid their potential liability by relying on this unregulated mechanism of the rateros. And of course, it represents a significant savings. You can imagine a contractor that actually has to do everything by the book has to charge more for their services. And in a highly competitive environment that's informal and regulated in lots of ways, there's almost no incentive to do that. There's also very limited cost of relying on rateros. But the point I guess I really want to make is that the rateros system demonstrates a component of the informality of the world of farm workers, the social world, and it's that informality that lies at the heart of this point that I want to make about the meaning of law. Regulation and the incoherence of formal law. Several times each month, newspapers in Central Valley of California, the most concentrated agricultural area in the United States, print articles that read more or less as follows. This is a quote from a newspaper article. 13 farm workers were killed in the pre-dawn darkness Monday when their crowded van, operated by an unlicensed driver with a record of traffic violations, slammed into a tractor trailer in a remote road in southwestern Fresno County, authorities said. Farm workers are dying because of the rateros system. At least 63 have died in the Central Valley in the 5 years between 93 and 99. Others are left severely injured. Others are jailed for transporting workers under dangerous and illegal conditions or fined. Yet the rateros system is a central element of the component of an economy that is highly regulated, at least formally highly regulated. As such, the current situation of farm labor transportation, well, just step back for a second. We don't really even know how many people die because of the rateros system. And even less would we have any idea how many people are injured, because there are all sorts of accidents that happen all over the place. And if you talk to people who work with farm workers closely, almost everybody can relate to you cases of accident. And really the only system of reporting them are newspapers, and newspapers typically only report those that involve fatalities. So one can imagine this is a relatively significant public health issue or workplace safety issue. As such, so the current situation of farm labor transportation represents a troubling public policy issue. Here we have an apparently reasonable law requiring licensed drivers, safe inspected vehicles, and decent levels of insurance coverage, while the actual transportation of workers occurs under conditions that display a near complete disregard for the law. Why is this? And what does this mean as regards a deeper understanding of law's meaning? First of all, the law itself is not formally insufficient in definitional terms or lack of basic clarity. It is relatively concise and clear in terms of how it defines the transportation of farm workers and the conditions under which farm workers can be legally transported. Secondly, while it is quite easy and reasonable to find fault with the Department of Labor's enforcement of the law, and in many cases we're talking actually state enforcement agencies as well, because there's lots of state laws, the problems are insufficient for addressing the basic flaws in the regulation. In those rare instances when a concerted attempt is made to enforce the law, two things occur, and this has happened in the Central Valley of Florida. One, the enforcement agencies discover that very few workers are transported according to the required provisions. No great surprise to those of us who spend time with farm workers, but a fairly significant thing to discover in an industry that's meant to be so highly regulated in order to make the conditions better. For example, a recent check, out of 25 vehicles that were spot checked by the California Highway Patrol, 27 vehicles rather, 25 were cited for safety violations. The vast majority are uncertified and unregulated, and this turns up every time that there's a clampdown on the transportation of farm workers. Secondly, enforcement does little, if anything, to change the situation, other than confiscating a certain number of vehicles and assessing fines against low-income drivers. And to the degree that they don't follow through on that, there's the occasional warrant out for arrest. And you often hear of people who get in accidents or get in trouble just running away. Not an uncommon thing to do in a highly informal social world when faced with all sorts of problems. Understanding the growth of the rateros system as a response to regulation requires a consideration of the social world that the law seeks to regulate. A social world whose basic rules depend largely upon informal social controls. Who, after all, are farm workers? Currently, as I mentioned, over half of all farm workers are undocumented immigrants, individuals whose very employment represents a violation of federal law, both for the worker and the employer. Although interestingly, you may not know this, but does anyone know when it became illegal to hire undocumented workers in the United States? Just as a sort of 86, which you'd think, wow, that's not that long ago. It wasn't until the Immigration Reform Control Act of 1986 that it actually became illegal, where there was some sort of penalty to employing undocumented workers. The majority of these workers cross the border surreptitiously, entering the United States often with the assistance of smugglers, working with false papers, easily available within an immigrant community. These workers find their jobs informally, generally by word of mouth or through friends, relatives, or neighbors. In general, just about all the sociological research on immigration, undocumented immigration, shows, and actually documented immigration as well, shows that the number one component in seeking to understand what drives immigration are social networks, which are informal links between people who provide money, information, contacts, and various types of assistance, some of which are in direct violation of the law, like how do you get a fake Social Security card, how do you get a fake work permit, et cetera. It's also important to see how the informality of farm labor is directly bound to the very formally constituted world of agribusiness, which increasingly represents ever larger percentage of farm workers' employers. What I mean is that farms are becoming larger and larger. And whereas you could understand why small farmers might not be able to keep up on all the regulations, because it's hard as any kind of small business person, it's less easy to understand that problem with, say, a company like Dole, which has a whole army of people who deal with regulations and a whole world of in-house counsel and people who really keep abreast of this sort of stuff, pay lobbyists, et cetera. And basically, you're seeing more and more farm workers being employed by large operations. And growers are running businesses which are increasingly large and complex. They pay taxes, sign contracts, deal with banks, insurance companies, and government agencies, in every case following a vast array of rules and regulations and largely following them according to the book. Yet they rely on the informality of the farm labor system at virtually every turn when it comes to the people who actually harvest the crops. This is enabled by the growers' reliance on contractors who often operate in a largely unregulated informal world, directly bound to the daily social reality of farm workers. They recruit workers from street corners by word of mouth. They rarely establish formal employment agreements like contracts. Despite regulations to the contrary, contractors often pay crews in cash and keep no records. Obviously, they're hiring large numbers of people who you can't legally hire. Those contractors who abide by the law either charge more for their services or turn to a variety of subcontractors, raiteros and others, who then operate informally. Now, without going too far in this next point, this is another reason why farm workers are interesting to look at as a case study, is in fact the use of subcontractors in lots of industries is becoming increasingly a component of our economy, and it's starting to make other workers look more and more like farm workers. And it has a key relationship to large immigrant populations and to an ability to avoid the formal demands of a legal system and a regulatory structure, which is, instead of hiring janitors as employees of your company, which was the standard operation in the United States for years, you subcontract out to a janitorial service. And among other things, often avoid your legal liability for things they might do. And this is really quite significant given in certain parts of the country, say parts of the country where there's a very high population of undocumented immigrants and a whole series of informal systems that look a lot like farm labor. What's interesting about farm labor is it's almost always been that way. So you're seeing other workers looking more like farm laborers. And this has a very direct relationship to the growing divide between low-wage workers and higher-wage professional workers. Let me just... Shame and some final thoughts. Perhaps one way to reflect upon the tensions I've been discussing is by considering the surprising word in the title of this paper, and that word is shame. Regulations, codes, laws, and other formal means of producing order utilize a language that we are familiar with and refer to constantly in policy studies. Yet shame plays no role, or virtually no role, in this type of discourse. Important as shame may be to all of us in guiding our actions, there's no formal sense in which shame operates to name the regulatory work of law. However, shame is a word that comes to mind almost immediately when discussing the situation of migrant farm workers. That is, while shame appears to be distant from the discourse of law's meaning, it is central to many descriptions of our social encounter with farm workers, and quite important for consideration of perspective as regards power and the responsibilities inherent in one's social positioning. I'll try to make sense of that in a second. Let's consider two understandings of shame. First, the man who gave us the title of the paper, "The Law Makes Us Feel Ashamed," is the voice of a raitero taken from the book, and I thought I'd read sort of the more extended version of what he says. It's just a paragraph. Now I'm using a van that carries 9 people. My van isn't registered, and at $4 per worker, what he charges the workers to go to and from the fields, I can't afford insurance. So I work outside of the law. Before they began enforcing the laws, we didn't even know we were doing anything illegal. Now that we know about the laws, we feel guilty. Now we work with a certain anger. We're poor, we have to work, yet what we do is illegal. The law makes us feel ashamed. It's an interesting guy, that particular Raitero, because the one thing you discover when you speak to Raiteros is even though they're committing crimes and sometimes seriously endangering the lives of the people they transport, they're pretty small operators, and they really are, they're farm workers. They go out to the fields usually along with the people they carry, unless they're older or injured, which is sometimes the other class of people who become Raiteros. So it's a voice of a person who feels a certain shame for having to participate in a system. I mean, here's a guy who wants to make a couple extra bucks each day, hard to argue with. And yet, the nature of the system produces a sense of shame only after he knows that what he's doing is, in fact, illegal. That's where the shame comes from. It isn't the shame of bringing people to work and getting a few bucks. That makes lots of sense. It's the shame of having to do something that's illegal. The shame of encountering the formal demands of law within a context where another option doesn't present itself. A second sense of the word shame that really is probably key, sort of a key pillar of any reference to farm workers in the United States is Edward R. Murrow's classic 1963 film, Harvest of Shame, which really played an important role in sort of shaming the nation such that protective legislation was passed. And it happened at a time period when the U.S. was quite concerned about using the law to address a whole series of social inequities. So let's look at that word, that sense of shame. That sense of shame is the harvest of shame. Who is supposed to feel shamed? The American public, who has this direct relationship with farm workers by consuming fruits and vegetables on a daily basis. And yet one feels shamed by learning that the availability of these products that we so enjoy only comes to us as the result of the poverty of a whole class of workers, a fairly large class of workers. So it's a different sense of shame. Both types of shame, though, reveal the way in which we understand ourselves and our relationship to the larger social world. In one case, there's the shame of acting in a way that brings shame to oneself by discovering the illegality of certain actions, despite an inability to change the situation. In another, there's the shame of not acting to improve a situation that we are close to as consumers, yet distanced from as actors. I mean, most people really don't even know that farm workers exist. So what's the lesson here? Well, one lesson regards the meaning of law as a formal discourse and its essential limitations when superimposed in its formality over a highly informal social world. What does a law mean? We might ask, from what position is law meaningful? Since this is the lesson of this sense of shame we're discussing. The law assumes an understanding of social structure and subject position that may not always be everywhere the same. The formality of law, its formalistic meaning, is premised upon an assumption that all social actors approach the law from the same basic perspective, despite the fact that this may not be the case. Law is powerful, real, and indispensable, yet a consideration of the tension between law's formalism and other less formal means of producing order is both useful and necessary. To remedy this, I'm suggesting the need to consider the way in which a law is rendered meaningful in distinct social worlds. This may at times be too much to ask from an essentially formal construction, and one that's defined by clear rules of operation, the law. Yet by failing to grasp this element of the legal, many laws will actually turn out to be bad policy. Thanks very much.